Who knows what Jay-Z, J.K. Rowling, Bill Gates and Oprah Winfrey all have in common? Okay, I will tell you then. They have all overcome failure in one shape or form to go on to gain success in their respective careers. Welcome to My Perfect Failure. Join us as we delve into the world of our perfect failures. We will interview, explore, and discuss how our perfect failures can lead us to success. Join us and tune in.
Welcome everybody to another episode of My Perfect Failure. Today, I'm super excited as I have an amazing guest for you. So my guest today is the founder of the multi-award winning co-creation community LIMINAL, a company dedicated to providing insights as well as innovation to ensure females can flourish during life's biggest biochemical transition from peri to post-menopause. So these are things that I've been learning about. I have no idea about peri and post-menopause. So yes, I'm learning a lot. A researcher by trade with over 20 years experience listening to people and shaping products and services to respond to their wants and needs. Liminal's philosophy is driven by innate curiosity, deep respect for science and medical insights, as well as emerging research pointing to the potential of traditional medicine and complementary therapy. So a very warm welcome to My Perfect Failure, Rebekah Brown. How are you, Rebekah?
I'm very well. Thank you for having me, and thank you for sharing that rather long bio. It's always
hugely relevant bio there, because it captures the essence of you, a bit of the journey, not all the journey. We're going to get into a bit of the journey now. Fascinating journey, and I'm excited to explore. I kind of gleaned a second ago that I've learned a bit over the last week or so about the menopause, which I had zero, and I was aware of the word, but in terms of what the menopause is and the multiple symptoms that women go through and the length of cycles, I guess it varies. I had no idea, literally.
And I did reassure you before we pressed record that that's not unusual. I mean, it's also not unusual for us as females as well, because our generation didn't learn about it at school. Doctors receive on average about 4 hours training on menopause. So many doctors really don't know the kind of the warning signs of menopause. And even gynecological experts will usually get about sort of a couple of days in terms of learning. So I think the stat that shocked me when I first started exploring menopause was that in that kind of particular specialism, you obviously expect the individual to be an expert in your biochemistry as a woman, and yet I think only 20% of those postgrad courses have a syllabus focused on menopause. So we as females, we hit this life stage and it genuinely knocks most of us sideways. And I think because it happens so much earlier than the narrative we hear in the media, where we think menopause is something that happens to you when you're kind of old, like maybe you're, we don't realize it actually begins in our early 40s, and for some of us a little bit earlier. So yeah, you should not feel bad that you don't know about it. It's something that we all need to learn about.
I definitely know more now. Do you think there's women out there that are going through difficult moments, some of the challenges? Like, obviously there's a myriad of different symptoms, but maybe they just don't know, but they're going through these challenges which may impact different spheres of their lives. It could be sleep, it could be maybe their day-to-day activity at work, it could be maybe their relationships with their children or their spouse, but maybe they're not aware of M-Powder or Liminal. We're going to get into that in a second. Potentially just suffering in silence.
Yeah, and I think, the research kind of points to that being very much the case. When I think about my own personal journey, the challenge with perimenopause is that, as I was saying just now, it happens much, much earlier than we anticipate. We probably haven't even heard of the word.
Yeah,
there's a little bit more media attention, but if you're not looking out for it, you won't have absorbed it. And the symptoms that are quite often the earliest ones for us to experience can be related to all kinds of things. So, for example, for me, it was extreme anxiety imposter syndrome. I was bloated, my hair was falling out. I had, horrible hormonal acne. None of that was symptoms I'd ever read about being associated with my menopause transition. And sort of combine that with then going into a doctor's surgery where that doctor may not also be aware of those early warning signs. And quite often women are prescribed antidepressants by mistake, or more often they think there's something they've done wrong. And so that's why we see so many women struggling in the workplace, for example, and kind of almost like just drawing away from the world because they feel that they're no longer able to do their job as well as they could before, that maybe they can't cope with stress, but they don't quite understand why. So you're absolutely right. So many of us will spend 3 or 4 years, the stats say, before a diagnosis of menopause transition is given to us, either by a doctor or quite often actually by a friend. It's often someone else who's further along in the journey that will point to those symptoms and be that person that gives that other female that light bulb moment where you say, have you spoken to your doctor about the fact you may be actually heading into menopause?
Yeah, that's a crazy stat that people potentially, or women potentially, struggle for 4 years before maybe they bump into a friend or they read an article or maybe they visit their doctor. And you think about that 4 years of difficult challenges on a day-to-day basis. But I guess it's the confusion as well, maybe feeling helpless that you just can't understand why they're experiencing these symptoms on a daily basis. That's pretty horrendous to me.
It's really frightening, and many of us feel like we may be, struggling with a disease that hasn't been diagnosed. So, I thought that maybe I had early onset Alzheimer's or some form of cognitive decline because I couldn't hold stats. As a researcher, I basically couldn't do my job. But also to your point around the very real impact it has on us psychologically. Sadly, this time of life is the highest instance of suicide for women. Our divorce rates peak at this period in our life as well, because if your body's betrayed you, if your mind's betrayed you, and you don't feel like yourself anymore, it has a huge impact on the way that you move through the world and the relationships you have with others as well. So it really is. I mean, I'm a glass half full person, and all of the work we do at Liminal is designed to enable women to see the potential of part 2. But we can't really do that without also, shining a spotlight on the very real risk for us as females and as for society as a whole, because we're half of society, for us not knowing and being able to be fully supported at this life stage. It really is something that demands systemic change at pretty much every level of society in order for us to be able to thrive.
It's a wonderful initiative that you're doing. The reason that to me it's wonderful because there's clearly a problem for women with a lack of, I guess, base education from maybe being at secondary school to all the way through to 40s and 50s and beyond. And I guess from your own journey, your own challenging situation, you've almost stumbled across a gap that really needs somebody to take the initiative and actually, I guess, empower existing. Now it's Liminal. But can I maybe get into how you discovered that your situation was, is it menopausal was a word, but it was connected to your menopause. So there's these 2 words. You've got Peri Menopause and you've got menopause. Maybe initially, could you explain the difference for me and people that are listening?
Yeah, of course. So female bodies are amazing. We're cyclical creatures.
Thumbs
so
up.
the moment we have our first menstrual bleed, we're on a cycle, and that cycle is usually 28, 31 days for most of us if we're well and we don't have an underlying health condition. And during that cycle, our hormones fluctuate and they kind of do a dance. And our sex hormones play the biggest role in that dance. So that's our estrogen, our progesterone, and to a certain extent, testosterone as well. And from our late 30s, as our ovulation shifts and we become effectively less fertile, our sex hormones are declining. And that effectively is when we enter perimenopause. Statistically, that's early 40s. So peri just means before. So none of these labels are useful.
Really?
So perimenopause is before, and that can last 8 to 10 years. And as we were discussing earlier, the interesting thing about that is because our hormones are like an orchestra, although we focus a lot on the fact that our sex hormones are the ones that become very irregular and they fluctuate hugely. And if you ever see a chart of what perimenopause looks like, it's actually quite a liberating thing to see, because you suddenly realize, that's why that's why I'm feeling like I am, because it looks like one of those heart monitors you see in ER. What that means is that because of the orchestra of hormones that exist in our bodies, everything else gets thrown out of whack. It's like three instruments are kind of out of tune, but that impacts your cortisol, your serotonin, your oxytocin, all of your other hormones and neurotransmitters change as well. And menopause, again, unhealthily, basically means 12 months since your last menstrual bleed. And most women don't know when that is. Most of us don't track. Most of us will have had this perimenopause phase where our cycle has become a lot less regular. We may go 3 months, 6 months, and then have a bleed, or we may have 2 bleeds in 1 month. And so to expect us as humans to actually remember and to actually be able to note when our menopause occurs is again, highly unlikely. And then you lay on top of the fact that many of us are on contraception, so we're not having a sort of what you'd call a natural bleed anyway. So menopause is an anniversary. It's 12 months since the last time you bled. And at that point, it's a moment in time, menopause. You then become postmenopause, which again is really unhelpful, because postmenopause would imply that at some point you emerge from postmenopause, and you don't. Postmenopause is basically the rest of your life. It's your life without those sex hormones. They come down and they kind of deplete. You no longer have a bleed, you're no longer menstruating at all. That therefore means that you're postmenopause. So that's kind of how the biochemistry of females work, and that's why it's so confusing for us, because actually a bit like if you've ever had a pregnancy as a woman, I always think it's interesting to say that the first trimester is often when you feel the worst. And that's in Western culture, we often don't tell people that we're pregnant in those first 3 months, because we want to know that the baby's safe. And it's often after the 12-week mark that you tell everyone, but it's the 1 to 12-week mark when we're all feeling awful, where we actually need the support. And it's similar with perimenopause. We've had a lot of focus on menopause, which is this moment in time, whereas actually period of time we really need the support is perimenopause, when we're at our most vulnerable, when our bodies really are dealing with this extreme external stress. And it's like a reverse puberty, but because we don't know we're in it, and because the symptoms can be related to so many things, anxiety, how can I tell if that's perimenopause or just the fact that I'm at the pinnacle of my career, or I've got kids at home, they're taking their GCSEs or their A levels, or they're leaving home. And so menopause often happens this sandwich generation of women who are dealing with home life, dealing with ambition, dealing with aging parents. And so to decouple what's happening to our hormones and relate that to biochemistry rather than external stress is really hard. And then the final thing to highlight for women listening to this, and their partners, if they're male, or their friends, is that our hormones actually are impacted by external stress. So the more stressful your life is on the outside, the more extreme your perimenopause symptoms are going to be. So there is that kind of relationship between the way you move through the world, the way you digest stress, and actually the way you experience this menopausal transition too.
Wow, that's a lot to contend with.
It is a lot.
That's a lot to contend with.
And
there's a lot
and I
to
think
understand.
the thing is, yeah, there is. And I think the thing that frustrates me as a researcher is you're absolutely right, but knowledge is power. I mean, it's one of those sort of truisms, isn't it? And I think the minute women and men understand what it is that we go through, we also need to then overlay the positive things that happen. Our bodies are phenomenal, and in menopause, as we transition into postmenopause, women become more empathetic, they become more purpose-driven, they become more interested in legacy. The grey matter in their brain grows because they're wise and they've got all of that knowledge to impart. And so there's many things that happen to us that are incredibly valuable and are really things to look forward to and embrace. But that's very hard to do when you're in it and no one told you it was going to happen, and no one told you the tools that may help.
Absolutely. Wow. A bit of a minefield even. So your journey, you went through you described the challenges that you had to navigate. Sounds well, beyond challenging, some of the symptoms that you had. How were you diagnosed?
Well, I'm one of those sad stats actually where I wasn't. So I went to the doctor with extreme anxiety, as I was saying to you earlier, and I was running my own business at the time. I'd kind of pushed myself. I definitely was pushing myself, and I did have external stress happening in my life as well. So what happened, I don't hold the doctor responsible on any level, is I went in with all of my symptoms and all of my life story, and he decided that I was burnt out or depressed, and I was offered antidepressants or really the opportunity to take time out. And I was lucky in that I ran my own business and I could take 6 months to get well. And I also knew enough about depression to know that I wasn't depressed, because, and many women will relate to this, I would have a couple of weeks where I felt entirely incapable of doing anything, and then a couple of weeks where I could run a small country. And so I knew there was this kind of weird, like, extremes happening. And obviously that was my hormones. And I decided, this was 7-8 years ago, so the word perimenopause really wasn't in the common domain, and there weren't the sort of media stories or the celebrities using their platform to help educate us all. It really was very, very early in that whole conversation. And I think being a researcher effectively saved me, because I decided to take 6 months off. I was very lucky that because I had my own business, I could just stop consulting. Very few of us have that privilege. And I was able to use my researcher's mind to just start looking into what could be happening to my body. And again, not everyone has that luxury or that love of data
or that mind
to go and do it. Or that kind of, yes, that curious ride that likes unpicking knots. And I ended up sort of passing my way into functional medicine conferences, meeting with people at the forefront of sort of biochemistry and female health research. And the more I looked into it, I learned there was this life stage that no one had told me about. And obviously my symptoms correlated almost exactly to what would be expected for somebody transitioning through their early perimenopausal years. And then the more I looked into it, it became actually a really, as I say, a really sort of optimistic landscape for me, because I realized there was an awful lot I could be doing to nourish my body and mind. And it was almost an opportunity. I think women, quite often they reach their early 40s and we are conditioned, because we navigate a world that does feel other to us. In the doctor's surgery, we're seen as tiny men quite often. In the workplace, we have to perform like tiny men. And so we spend our lives really forcing ourselves through and almost ignoring our cycles and our biochemistry. And the more you look into what we can be doing, the more you realize that this pause point is actually an opportunity to reframe your relationship with yourself, but also what you want to be, because we are the first generation that may be lucky enough to have maybe 40 or 50% of our lives postmenopausal. And it is an opportunity to go, well, what do I want that to be? Do I want to be able to get out of the chair? Do I want to be able to sort of lift my own shopping bags? Do I want to actually be able to manage my stress so that I can enjoy this phase? Do I want to be able to move through my career and still excel, but not be compromising my health anymore? Like, how do I do that? So I think, the tools that are available to us, there are so many now that are very well backed from a scientific point of view. Obviously we have hormone therapy, which is phenomenally helpful for so many of us. But on top of that, it's looking at many tools that should be in every human's toolkit, but maybe now is a time for us to really sort of take them seriously. And I think that is the opportunity for us as women. For me, I started to get well as a result of applying quite a lot of those practices. So meditation was really helpful for me in my cortisol levels, journaling, yoga, nutrition. And then I got very interested in botanicals and the potential of plants from a herbal therapeutic level. And that really is what led to the launch of our community, as I realized that there's quite a lot of information that I'd acquired that I didn't. It took me a long time to find, and I was conscious that none of my friends would have the patience or the interest to read through reams of research data. But also I really benefited from a very small survey I did on Instagram, where I tiptoed onto the platform as a researcher to understand what had helped other people at my life stage. And normally as a researcher, no one responds to anything unless you give them Amazon vouchers or you offer them a nice platter of sandwiches or whatever. So I didn't really expect much from my outreach, and I was absolutely inundated. And I was inundated because I hadn't allowed for the generosity of spirit of women. And I think we are, as women, incredibly good at supporting each other at these life stages that are unique to us as females. So whether that's menstruation or early parenthood or loss or menopause, we share our stories, and actually those stories help us navigate the world. And I realized if you could capture those stories and kind of smash them together with all of the research I was reading about, we could start making products, programs that genuinely made a difference to women's lives. And what I felt was missing maybe in some of the conversations I was having with expert practitioners was the voice of the female. And then I was talking to the females, and what was missing for them was the voice of the expert. You know, they just weren't getting through.
Yeah.
So that really is what our community is designed to do, is to kind of bring those two forces together,
Yeah.
and then create things that can make us feel well.
It's phenomenal, your journey and what you've done today, because I'm sure you've got, it might be more than this, but over 30,000 people within your community at the moment, which is phenomenal.
That's right, yeah.
Which is phenomenal.
Yeah, thank you.
So you go from doing, essentially, almost feels like you've gone to the doctor, he's kind of given you a bum steer and said you're depressed, kind of like just, you know, take these tablets and you'll be fine. So kind of like a misdiagnosis. Your curiosity led you to go on this quite phenomenal journey, because you're kind of having to do all this research and heal yourself almost by reading and meeting different experts and bringing everything together. So then you decided, actually, based on, you know, you did the Instagram reach out and you realize actually there is a huge problem here and there's nobody really addressing this. So maybe this is something that I can address. Had you thought about actually going, because it's quite a mammoth journey that you've been on to kind of start a business, you're creating products for your community to help them heal, to help them educate them on perimenopause and menopause, and there's lots of other things that are attached to it. So when did you decide that I'm going on this journey?
It's fascinating, isn't it? Because I'm kind of embarrassed to say I didn't. I think what happened when I look back on it is, as a narrative researcher, I'd kind of spent my whole career, as you were saying in the intro, kind of listening to people and kind of collecting stories and trying to understand what those stories were telling us about future wants and needs, and how actually by really listening, not just doing that kind of customer first or customer centric stuff, which is a little bit sort of surface level, I always feel, but really putting at the heart lived experiences into how society operates and how commercial ventures operate. I think what happened was when I tiptoed onto Instagram, I saw that there was a collective need, and I felt strangely qualified to act as a kind of facilitator, because that's really all I am. I'm not a nutritionist or a naturopath. I'm not an expert. I'm not a doctor. But what I am expert in is listening. And I think what I couldn't see anywhere else was that willingness, because it's really messy listening, because there was no one point of view. There's no you have to listen wholly. You can't half listen. And I think I was willing to do that. And I kind of felt that that's what the world needed. And I feel this quite passionately about female health generally. I think, or any taboo topic, any category that has been kept in the shadows for whatever reason, you cannot, I don't think, move forward optimally without listening to every voice. And so I found myself thinking, I need to do this, not because I'm qualified to do any of the stuff that we make. You know, I felt I had a huge sense of sort of imposter syndrome about being the person that brought this community together. But what I did recognize in myself was that I'd almost trained my whole life in listening. And our business is really complicated because of our commitment to listening. You know, we are a nightmare for our for our production partners, because we reformulate our products based on data that comes back to us and what our consumers say. We don't just push something out and say magnesium should be taken at this level and it will work. And it's like, well, what if it's not working? What if actually in the real world, outside the lab, we need a lower dosage of magnesium in the morning because it's actually really useful to take some more at night. So let's actually make the brave decision to be honest and remove some of it from our product so they can take an independent supplement that isn't ours in the evening because they'll actually feel better. Or, you know, there's not enough research into ashwagandha, so we'll do it. Or actually what women want to be talking about is, you know, their legal rights in the workplace. So who's talking about that? No one. Let's run a workshop on that. So we kind of, it's meant for very messy growing of a business. And in some ways, I kind of look at that traditional growth trajectory that you would expect when you find a product with market fit. And we've made life much, much more difficult for ourselves, but with a real commitment to listening. And I think that's why we've grown in a sort of measured way as a business. But we've kind of got this huge generosity of spirit, and when people find us, they stay, you know, partly because the products work, but I think partly because they feel they're genuinely seen and heard. And they're not seen and heard in so many of the relationships they have with brands or with the outside world. You know, over 2/3 of us still think that menopause is a taboo topic that we shouldn't be talking about in public. So it's an incredibly sensitive topic for so many of our community, and providing that safe space and ensuring that when they do have the bravery to speak, they're genuinely heard, I think is critical.
Yeah. It's a massive education piece that you've undertaken on every level, really, from your own perspective. That I guess that there's been a huge learning journey, and also for your community, because your community, it feels like you're listening to them, you're educating them, you're giving them confidence in symptoms that they've been going through for a long period of time, which probably never ever made sense to them. Now they've got a community where they can engage, they can be listened, they can offer their own experience, which I guess is valuable to you and your team.
Yeah.
So just for people listening that are keen to understand a little bit more about the products, maybe you can give us a bit of a steer on the products that you've developed.
Yeah, and of course. So, I mean, I think the fascinating thing about botanicals is they have been used in traditional medicine for hundreds of years. And what's brilliant about being alive in this moment in time is that the Western world is getting more and more interested in their potential, and we're kind of almost verifying the benefits that these plants have using modern methods. So we formulate naturopathic products. So that means two things. One, naturopathy is all about this whole body and mind approach to wellness. So we are not a silver bullet as a formulation. I think that's a really important thing that we're very honest about with our consumers as well, is that naturopathy is about layering up. So it's about looking at your nutrition, it's looking at how you digest stress, it's looking at how you sleep, it's looking at how you move. And we try and provide this kind of surround support system with every product. So when you buy a product that's a naturopathic formulation, you're also buying into our community, which is where all of the education and the online seminars and things are offered to you. And then the formulations themselves are the result of product impact studies with our community, but also, you know, to your point earlier about people sharing their feedback, we collect all of that. So we're able to look at the symptoms that bother people most. And I think that's the fascinating thing when you're looking at, again, an underserved and under-researched life stage, is that we've got that list of 48 symptoms that are associated with menopause, and there are probably a lot more. However, what we don't look at enough as researchers is what bothers people most. And that's always it's a very nuanced point, but it's a really important one. So you might have, I don't know, a woman who's got 20 hot flashes a day, but they don't bother her as much as her hair loss. You know, I as a researcher can't tell you what is going to be the thing that upsets you the most about this life stage. And so I think that's the other unique thing about the way we've approached our formulation, is we focus in on the things our community tell us bother them most. And that has led to the formulation so far of 4 products. One is like a foundation layer for Peri Menopause. It looks to address the most persistent and bothersome symptoms based on our data. The second one is a powdered formulation for postmenopause that does the same thing, because, as you know, I was describing that kind of hormone roller coaster as it transitions and we go into our postmenopausal years, the symptoms and also the things that bother us shift, as you would expect. So that's what that product does. And then we have 2 capsulated formulations that have been the result of 3 years of data analysis. And they look at the cluster symptoms, because what's been fascinating for us is the more data we were getting back from these women, the more we realized that there were these little loops that were kind of connected to the way our hormone pathways work. So mood food, for example, which is, you know, one of our best reviewed products, just gets phenomenal results, is a capsule that looks to address mood, cognitive function, and sleep, because those 3, they act as a little domino where if you've got one, the other one's very likely to show up. So, for example, if you're not sleeping, it'll impact your cortisol. When you wake up in the morning, you're likely to wake up with that in your chest because you're anxious, because your cortisol is much higher than it should be, and it doesn't come down in the way that it should in the morning, because most of us should wake up, that's how we wake up, is with cortisol. But what we don't want is it to continue going sky high, and when it does, that leads to anxiety, and then it inhibits other hormones in our brain, which leads to brain fog. So you end up with this cycle, and obviously if you're anxious and you're struggling at work, you don't sleep. So mood food looks to address that cluster symptom. And then our final product is one called Gut Instinct, that again was a result of 3 years of analysing data. And what we were seeing was real intolerances, like to food that used to love you that no longer loves you back, bloating, constipation. And we know from research that our gut microbiota is impacted by menopause. That's kind of big studies have shown that. But what is interesting and what we're seeing in clinic is that the popularity of probiotics, which we've all read about and we all kind of tend to turn to now when our stomachs aren't doing what they should, they can actually exacerbate gut issues for us in menopause. So Gut Instinct's a probiotic formula, directly designed to coach your gut using amazing botanicals and support your gut microbiota in feeding itself. So there's a very important distinction between prebiotics, which is what our formula is, and the role of probiotics. So those are the 4 formulations in market currently. And as I say, they're kind of supported by our Menowell Masterclass program, which are monthly online sessions with different experts. And those are also voted for by our community. So you get covered everything from HRT, so masterclasses with doctors explaining what to expect, how to ensure it works optimally for you, right through to things like cold water therapy or journaling, or as I was saying earlier, sort of legal support in the workplace.
Wow, I'm just thinking about everything that you've done with the formulas, the work that you had to do to make sure that the formulas were impactful. Obviously, there's 4 different products. Have you had to be, because we live in a society today where we want everything yesterday. Have you had to be patient when you're going through the process, because you know that you've got a great idea, but patient waiting for the formulas to be right so you can support your community with them?
Yes, I think that's a really good point. I think we've had to choose our own pace and our own success metrics, because we are a business that has had pre-seed and seed investment, and we've been incredibly lucky that our shareholders also see our vision as core to their investment decision, because we are contrary to the supplement space where traditionally you make something as quickly as possible, you get it out and you don't touch that formula because you want to make thousands and thousands of those pills. I don't have any economies of scale because I'm having to create artisanal batches to test and learn, which is very frustrating for my production partners. But as you say, means we have to be incredibly patient as a brand and a community. And also, we've had huge periods of time where we've been out of stock because we won't compromise on the quality of our ingredients. And that has been really tough for us as a business, because you're trying to explain to consumers that the reason they can't get hold of mood food is that the turmeric is really high grade, and there's global conflict that means that the products aren't getting into the country, or there's been a really unfortunate harvest because of the climate changes that we're seeing, and because we work with organic sources, sometimes they can be impacted because they're not having the same kind of industrial grade chemicals sprayed all over them. So sticking to our principles as a brand is incredibly important, but it does, you make those choices, and you have to then choose different metrics as a business to determine what success means.
Yeah, absolutely. And didn't you launch during the pandemic or around that period?
Yes, we did everything wrong,
must have been
basically. Yes, I think again, it's quite apt that this is called My Perfect Failure. But that had so many implications for us as a business, because the fascinating thing for me was, as researcher, going back to this point about our hormones responding to external stress as well as the biochemical changes our bodies go through, we could see whilst we were trying our first product that the lockdown and actually the news cycle, so when key decisions were communicated to the UK populace, we saw a peak in symptom severity.
Really?
You could almost align it with what was happening in the news. It was fascinating.
And it must be amazing, an amazing feeling for you to have gone through this process whereby, unfortunately, you were misdiagnosed and you had to experience what you experienced. But the upshot of that is you've created, I guess, empowered now liminal. But also, I guess the most important thing is you've grown this great community, this wonderful community, but you're supporting people, you're educating people, you're making your community understand their bodies, understand them, I guess, their minds, but also they've now got these, I guess, the supplements, but also the community, I think it's the wellness sessions that they can attend as well. So it must be amazing for you and your team to see the impact that you're having on your community.
I think the thing that's been really lovely and probably because I'm not I don't know if there is a typical entrepreneur, but I wouldn't say that I fit a typical profile of entrepreneur. But I think the reason that I've been able to do this is that it has felt like a community effort. So I've never felt like I'm, people say, oh, it must be so lonely. It's never been lonely for me because I've had all, I've got all these voices, I've got all these opinions constantly. And so I've never felt like I'm sitting in a corner making decisions. I feel like I'm listening really hard and then making a call on what the best next step is being. I think actually that's probably what's made it much, I wouldn't say easy because it hasn't been easy at all, but much more. I've been very aware from day one of both the impact, but also the fact that I'm acting also as a custodian, not as a CEO.
Okay.
And that has actually made life easier for me. And it's meant that feedback loop is really, really immediate as well. Both when people are disappointed, it's important to say, as well as when they're really, really grateful. And that also means that, as you say, as a team, we have a very, very real impression of the impact we have every day, and that definitely makes it worthwhile.
Yeah, I want to get on to the evolution to liminal second, but I've just got a question around listening. So listening clearly is a skill that not many of us have, but it's an important skill that we should all nurture and develop. And clearly that's essential to what you guys do. So do you have to develop the skill to understand what to listen to, maybe what not to listen to? Because if there's maybe, I don't know, sometimes we can get steers that maybe can lead us down, or is it an experimentation? Because I think invariably how we create great products or great services is around experimentation, because we never get it right immediately. There's an evolution.
Yeah, no, it's a really good question, and you're absolutely right. It's definitely an evolution, and I think and we can all learn to listen. I think it's one of those things, like you say, it's a skill rather than an inherent characteristic of a human. And much of listening goes back to actually listening for the words. So I'm a narrative researcher, and so it's looking at the words that people use, and then what those words really mean, unpacking them, which is why I've been fascinated by, for example, the word menopause, because it's so loaded with negativity and inherited narratives around hot flashes and mood swings and difficult women and rage and all of those things. Whereas actually that's not the lived experience of menopause for any woman I've ever spoken to. But the word carries so much meaning with it, and so quite often when you're listening for the words that are chosen, and then almost the spaces between those words. And that is something that you, I think, develop if you've got empathy and you allow space for people to communicate. And so what's been interesting for us as a business is that the evolution of AI has been incredibly helpful, because when I first started out my career and I was listening to people, it'd be transcripts of conversations like this, and then I would be ringing words and going, "That's interesting. That word was used here, and I wonder what that actually means." And I could sense this as a result of that being said. Whereas now, I can ask very complicated or open-ended questions via a survey link or whatever I choose, and narrative AI is so sophisticated that it can look to attribute emotion to the words that are coming back to me in written form. And so we're able to start scaling our interpretation and drawing links. So to your point, to avoid maybe making the wrong decision because one person says something over here, we're able to get a much broader balanced picture as a result of some of these tools that are coming into the research space now.
Fantastic. AI is fascinating, and it's great that we can embed that into some of the things that we do today. So when I met you, so for everybody watching and listening, so you were about to get in a lift at I think it was a Retail X conference.
Yeah.
I just heard you on a stage giving a keynote with a panel, and I thought I need to speak to Rebekah before she goes. And you're about to jump into the lift and probably have to go to another appointment. So just before you got in the lift, I was like, "Do you do podcasts?" And then what's it about? What's it about? And then we just had this quick exchange, and then we connected. And but when the reason I make that point, because you've gone in this evolution from M powder to liminal. So I'd love to know why the evolution, and I love the meaning behind liminal as well.
Well, you're being very polite, because obviously what I did say to you is that my perfect failure was the naming of the company as M powder. So the very long story cut short, and the irony behind it obviously being that I'd spent my career, as you know, as a narrative researcher, but working in agencies as what they call a creative planner. So much of my work was future trends and helping companies ensure that they positioned their brand correctly. And because M powder was first and foremost my own route back to wellness, I had used it as a word. Well, it basically is a label for my desktop file that had all of my research into the powders that I was formulating as my own little human guinea pig experiment in the early days of my own Peri Menopause. So when I was reading about botanicals, I was using dehydration machines to create therapeutic dosages of different plants. I began to feel well, but they were truly disgusting concoctions, and obviously not overseen by anyone vaguely qualified. But the name M powder was this dumping ground that I was sticking everything into. And when we came to do our first product impact study, we were by that point working with phenomenal experts in their field. The leading one being Dr. Martins, who's our scientific lead in naturopath and herbalist. Okay. And so we had a formulation for Peri Boost, its first formulation. And we'd recruited via Instagram 50 women that were going to take the product for 20 weeks and to take part in a very, very deep research process. Actually, it was a big ask for them. They were reporting back to us weekly on symptoms. They were attending weekly calls with us, and we were really looking to understand the impact that our blends would have on them. And then the pandemic happened. I think we went into lockdown 2 days before I was due to ship this product.
Really?
And obviously at the time we thought, well, it'll only be a few weeks.
Yeah.
We'll send it out anyway, but we better get it out quickly. And so all of the naming work that we were doing around creating a brand that would reflect this life stage, we just have to get the product out the door. So we called this first batch, this beta batch, M powder, got it out to our community, and then the pandemic meant that we were worrying about distribution and ingredients getting into the country, and really that whole debate about how you capture the essence of what this life stage feel like fell to the back of the queue and stayed there, I'm embarrassed to say, for 3 years, during which time I was having all of these conversations with people. And I think, you know, the massive failure for me as a business was that M powder never reflected what this life stage feels like. And my job is to reflect the stories I'm given and I hold. And I'm delighted that we finally got to a name that really does with our community, because what I wanted to capture was everything we've talked about today, is that, you know, this life stage can be really swarthy, can be really tough, but actually with the right tools and support, it's a stepping up point and not fading away. And as you all know, you know, the word liminal is used quite often in psychology and also in art, interestingly, and it means the space between. So it's that period of time between what was and what's yet to come. You know, what used to serve you and what may serve you in the future, what you used to be and what you are becoming. And back to the very beginning of this conversation, you know, I described females as being almost uniquely cyclical. And I think that's fascinating, because we are always on some form of transitional journey because of the way our biochemistry works. And so liminal has really captured, I hope, that spirit where it can feel quite frightening, but it can also feel quite liberating. And it is actually where good change happens. We just need those support, those kind of guardrails to help us get from one side to a side we may not actually be able to see yet. So that's the
Yeah.
reason for the name change. But that is also, to the point of your podcast, a reflection on probably the biggest failure I've made with this business so far.
Well, you were, in fairness to you, handicapped by a pandemic that nobody saw coming. And to your credit and your
True.
team's credit, you've done incredibly well to be where you are now, navigated, got this wonderful brand, got this amazing community. And there, sadly, there would have been any number of unfortunate different companies that wouldn't have survived or didn't survive because the pandemic arrived and it caused any number of different challenges. So you've done incredibly well. So for people that want to find out a bit more about your products, want to join your community, how should they get in contact with you?
I think the best way to kind of explore what we do is all of the free content that sits on social media. So on Instagram, we are live_liminal. And there you'll see lots of lives with experts, lots of stories from our community, but also information about botanicals and ingredients in our blends as well. And then if people are interested in learning more about the products explicitly, our website's incredibly informational. So there's a science section where there's, links out to every piece of clinical research, for example, and every botanical in our blend. So it's very important to us that you see the sort of the rigor that has gone into supplements, because I think the supplement space can be really difficult to navigate and to trust. And so if you're curious about learning about the blends, head to our website, which is www.liveliminal.com, and you can find out all about the blends there. And then if you're interested in kind of tasting a little bit of the community itself, then these monthly Men and Well classes are a really lovely way to explore perhaps a topic that's of interest to you. So you can find the details of what's up next on our website too.
Okay, lovely. So I will get all the links, put them on the show notes. Very easy for people to access, get in contact and dip into whatever area they want to dip into. And so two questions, I think, if I may. One is the future. What's the future? Because you feel like, to me, this feels like a global initiative, because women all around the world will suffer from the same confusion when they're entering that peri menopause phase, then leading to menopause. So do you have a future in mind that you see?
Yeah, I mean, you're absolutely right. So the ambition is that this should be a global offering. And I think what's really important to me is scaling for us will be doing it authentically. And that means grassroots sort of action and research and all the rigor that we look to within the UK being applied to new territories. So I'm hoping that the next 12 months will see us launch in other markets, but we will be launching first and foremost as a community, building up that bed of insight in terms of how our products fit into people's days, how their routines work around taking the blends, and then launching them in a way that ensures we can provide that wraparound health concierge. So it's unlikely that it will be it's unlikely that you'll see us in Walgreens, for example. It's much more likely that you'll see a sort of wraparound programmatic approach to taking the product into other markets. But we would love to be global.
Sounds incredibly exciting. And I'm going to sneak one more question, if I may. So this is around sort of the people that we expect to know more, like the medics, the doctors and so forth. Do you have any thoughts there? Are you able to support them? Like, what's going on with them? Because clearly, from your perspective, when you went to see your, GP or professional, they weren't able really to give you sound advice or accurate advice. So, so I just thought I'd ask around that.
No, it's a really good question. And I think what's been amazing actually is the UK is kind of leading the charge. So the stats I referenced earlier in terms of how much education is given to general practitioners, and also that kind of lack of postgrad education as well. That's global. So it's very similar stats in the US, for example. So females everywhere are having very similar experiences in the doctor's surgery, and that's coupled with a sort of an unfair fear of prescribing hormone therapy, which is to do with a WHI study that happened 20 years ago that your listeners can kind of look into. But basically, there was a period of time where practitioners who are obviously trained They go into what they do because they want to do good and they want to ensure no harm. But there was a piece of research that came out that kind of demonized hormone therapy, and overnight doctors stopped prescribing it and consumers stopped wanting it. And it's taken a long time for the miscommunication of that research, which was incredibly flawed, to be readdressed. And what we've seen in the UK is, alongside my own route to recovery, you've had a whole cohort of women, which I think is fascinating, reaching the pinnacles of their careers. So, becoming editors of broadsheet newspapers in the UK, celebrities with platforms and social media suddenly that would enable them to share this life stage that they'd suddenly found themselves in. And so the UK kind of almost like exploded with this activism around menopause, which has lent to legislative change. So we are one of the first countries where menopause is now being taught in biology lessons in secondary schools. That's only come in the last couple of years. We are one of the first governments to debate menopause in the workplace and look to how legislatively we can support women and stop this drain of talent leaving during this life stage. So the UK is doing an awful lot, and coupled with that has been a real look to redress the education of doctors. So a lot is going on. It's in a much better space than it was. We're probably leading the charge. Across social media, you've got some amazing doctors gifting their time and educating as much as they can. So it's going to take time, because one of the challenges actually is that, GPs, once you're obviously trained, you have to take time out to train yourself further, and you have to get onto these courses. But I do believe that the tide is turning, and what's most interesting to me is that women are going into their doctor's surgery empowered. They will have been tracking their symptoms quite often. They will be going and saying, I think I'm in perimenopause. Can you confirm that for me? Rather than me turning up and saying, I'm anxious, my hair's falling out, I can't sleep. No wonder the guy thought I was, burnt out or depressed. So I think, to your point, education is changing. There's a lot of pressure on the medical profession to ensure that new graduates are coming out informed and enabled to spot those symptoms and kind of join the dots. I think the tide is turning, and we work a lot with medical doctors. So we will work very, very hard to ensure that we're not seen as an alternative. So I think that's one of the risks, is that quite often when you're working with complementary practices, there's an assumption that you're anti-medical practice. We're not. We're very supportive of the work that doctors are doing. Okay, that's really encouraging. There does seem to be a shift in terms of being proactive, and so that's very encouraging for women. So sadly, I think we've reached the end, actually. So I do have one last question, which is a recurring question. So if you could invite 3 inspirational people for dinner, they can be a liable part. Who might you invite? No, this is a really difficult one. I'm so glad you didn't just throw that at me without giving me a chance to think about it. So I used to do. Because I literally would have had nothing to say to you. So I had 3. So my first one is the wonderful Lem Sisse, who's a poet. And the reason I would love to have him for dinner, and luckily he's still with us, is because he had an incredibly difficult life, but he has magic in him in terms of language and words. And the poetry that he writes moves me and reminds me almost daily of the power of language to transform how we feel and also how we see the world. So he would be number 1. So I'd just love to spend some time with him. What's his name again? He's Lem Sisse. And this book, if anyone's kind of if anyone thinks poetry isn't for them, buy this book. It's called Morning Poems, Let the Light Pour In. And it's fascinating. For the last 10 years, he has written a poem every morning when he wakes up, regardless of whether there's anything in his head or not. And this is just the ones that he's chosen to share with us. But they're beautiful, they're funny, they're thoughtful, they're sad, they're short. But they're a masterclass on the power of words. So he would be number 1. And then Lisa Mosconi, Dr. Lisa Mosconi, is a neuroscientist who's really focused her career on the female brain. And she has done a huge amount to help us understand our unique biochemistry, but also more recently her work has focused in on menopause and the menopause brain, and effectively what happens to our brain as a result of this hormone shift. So Dr. Mosconi and her published work I would want to talk about in detail. And then my final one was Oprah, which, I mean, I think everyone would like to have a chat with Oprah.
Yeah.
But I think it's because for me, she stared prejudice down in so many forms and yet has built an empire, a business empire in response. But what I love about her as a narrative researcher is that she's always got her audience front and center. She always goes back to her audience and what they need, and actually she often uses herself in an incredibly vulnerable way to help that audience make sense of the world. And I think that's a huge achievement and a huge lesson in truly understanding, I think, the relationship that we as business owners or brand owners should be having with our community.
Yeah, no, that's I was gonna say critical, but it's highly important. Critical is not the best word I could use, but really important that what Oprah does is pretty much what you're doing, putting your community and your audience front and center. Rebekah, wow, fantastic. Really enjoyed this discussion. Love what you're doing. Thank you for agreeing to talk to me when we met at
Thank you for finding me at the lift.
Well, exactly. Hopefully I didn't delay any meetings that you weren't delayed.
It was a pleasure.
But thank you so much. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
No, you're very welcome. Hopefully we can have more conversations in the future. That would be amazing. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in to this episode of My Perfect Failure. If you're watching on YouTube, please do hit the subscribe button. It really does help us grow the channel. And your feedback is most welcome. So we're keen to hear about the things you like and equally the things you don't like. So you can find me at paul@myperfectfailure.com, or you can find me via the feedback page on the website. So take care for now. Bye.
Thanks for listening to My Perfect Failure podcast. Be sure to visit www.myperfectfailure.com to join the conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes or Google Play. Look out for our next episode.